So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first talk of this edition of Rehumanism. Many thanks to Daniela Cotimbo, Rehumanism curator, and to everybody involved in this initiative. Tonight's talk is AI and Conflicts, Artificial Truth, curated by Krisis Publishing, which has recently published the book AI and Conflicts, a volume in which different authors reflect on the increasing presence of the so-called artificial intelligence and algorithmic technology, all within visual and cultural process. So it is a pleasure to be here sharing with you this debate. My name is Herman Duarte, and I'm very happy to moderate the discussion today, which is a discussion that will deal with the complex notion of truth, the way it is deployed by means of narrative, and the role played by contemporary technologies in its construction. It is a millenarian argument and certainly a deep concern that shapes Western conceptions of humankind. Always, with any expressions of any of these notions, truth, narrative, or technology, their intricate nature is manifest. Consider, for instance, the semantic space of the Greek notion of mythos. This word, indeed, means narrative, plot, myth, speech. But at the same time, for example, in the Odyssey, the same word, mythos, is described as true fact, as real story. Thus, this word is also present in a semantic space closer to what we could understand as an objective expression, as truth. It would be impossible to build a genealogy through which one could deconstruct and isolate elements that compose these complexes. This is to say, it will be impossible to isolate within the notion of truth elements belonging to the hypothetical sphere of real facts and elements pertaining to the field of pure fiction and imagination. Our experience of the world, as we know, is an agencement of both, is an agencement of all these indivisible elements. Nevertheless, naturally, another question emerged, and this question places us again within the classic age. What could be the meaning of truth for a knowledge that conceived through the same notion, through the same word, narrative, plots, myth, but also true facts, stories, objective information? Aletheia was the Greek word for truth. And it is not a coincidence that this notion re-emerged during the last century as a philosophical concern. The Second Industrial Revolution, for sure, played a central role in that. In fact, what could be aletheia, which literally means the state of not being hidden, within a technological context that sets in motion a technological force able to dematerialize everything, a force able to place humankind in a world largely composed of data. Heidegger is the philosopher that placed the notion of aletheia in the middle of his theory, and through this concept, he warned us about the disturbing fact that the world was turning into the exclusive domain of technology. Further, he considered technology to be an active entity that deeply transforms human sensitivity and consequently human experience of the world. According to Heidegger, a social context able to conceive a technological entity displaying autonomous features of cognitive functions is clearly a society that is facing a great danger. However, the great danger is certainly not only represented by the development of an intelligent technological entity, which will be, in that case, foreign to human construction of reality. Our recent and current experience demonstrate that we are indeed facing the danger of perpetuating, rationalizing, instigating, and automating human disaster. Artificial intelligence demonstrates itself as an extension and a consolidation of the series of human bias that contribute to construct our colonial truth, our racist truth, the truth that excludes and discriminates entire social categories, discriminates against millions and millions of individuals, the truth that recognizes targets and is unable to see that these targets are indeed humans. In this complexity, it becomes indispensable to identify the human place, and above all, the place of human language in the construction of truth, in the process of the collective construction of imaginaries. This panel will question the role of truth in the age of artificial intelligence. It is a pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Flavia Sodon, Federico Campagna, and Metahaven. Before I introduce our first panelist, so let me inform the audience that you can use the chat to ask questions. However, these questions will be discussed at the end of the presentation during the debate. So it is a pleasure to introduce the first panelist, Federico Campagna, who is a philosopher and writer. So he spent over 20 years in Milan, where he was active in the anarchist and autonomist network. He co-founded the street poetry collective Evelyn. In 2007, he moved to London, where he actually lived. And in 2009, he started a long-term collaboration with the Italian philosopher Franco Berardi, Bifo. In the same year, he co-founded the multilingual platform for critical theory through Europe. Federico's latest books are Prophetic Culture, Recreation for Adolescents in 2021, Technique and Magic, The Reconstruction of Reality, and The Last Night by Zero Books in 2013. He has a PhD from the Royal College of Art in London with a thesis on metaphysics and metaethics in the design of strategy video games. He has a Master of Science in Economic and Management of the Arts from Bocconi University in Milan and a Master in Cultural Studies from Goldsmiths University in London. He works as lecturer and tutor of the Master of Nonlinear Narrative in the Netherlands, and currently he is the director of the Rights Department at Adversarial Book. So Federico, welcome, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Herman, for introducing me. Thank you to Krisis Publishing for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be here with Flavia Sodon and Metahaven. And thank you, everybody, for logging in and connecting. So I have the pleasure of starting this day of these conversations about AI, but I will maybe begin our conversation in a bit of a strange way. I will begin by saying that AI is a very important topic. Of course, it has important consequences on the way in which we live. But to me, it's a topic that is of moderate interest. But it's not because it doesn't have substantial consequences of society, but because the arrival of AI is a less exceptional event than we usually present it. I would like to start by making you appreciate the normality, even the banality of the emergence of AI. And one way to do it is by looking at the words, the name and surname of this machinic entity, artificial intelligence. Let's begin with intelligence. As we know from the Latin root, intelligere means to gather, to choose together, or to choose in between. The activity of intelligence has to do with a number of actions. So, for example, observing an object or an environment of objects, filtering the different aspects and selecting among the different aspects that we see in this object, those that are more worthy of attention, and then recombining these relevant aspects to form an accurate picture of the object, supposedly accurate. Then the intelligent actor takes that picture instead of the object itself and uses it instead of the object. Now, this activity of intelligence, we know well, is very diffuse. Not only is different in every single people, but it's different also in many ways in the different creatures that there are in the world. Animals, plants, all of them engage in intelligence. In their own way, they observe, they filter, they recompose the environment that surrounds them through their own intelligence. We could even argue, for example, that even inorganic matter is a form of intelligence. For example, in the way in which certain molecules connect only with some other molecules, but not with others. So intelligence is a superabundant quality in the universe.
I think we have some problems with his connection. Federico, are you here? No, I think he's not online now. Maybe he has some problems with his connection. Maybe should we wait some minutes or? Okay.
Ironically, speaking of intelligence, I very stupidly managed to lose connectivity. Sorry.
Okay.
So sorry, I'll just bring back. I was trying to understand in what way we can look at artificial intelligence as not so much of a strange event. Looking at the way in which we understand it as intelligence, we see that intelligence is a superabundant quality in the universe. Plants, animals, even inorganic matter can be said to have intelligence. So intelligence is a superabundant quality, and the varieties of it are countless. So the arrival of a new machinic intelligence in itself as an event is not a revolutionary event. It's just another intelligence among the infinite countless other intelligence of different varieties that there are. It's a drop in the ocean. To believe that the arrival of this new intelligence is a big event, we would have to believe that before this arrival, there was only one form of intelligence, arguably the human intelligence, and this human intelligence was monolithic of one type only. This is too naive an idea that to really entertain. So maybe the uniqueness of AI is not in its being intelligent, but in its being artificial. And once again, I'm not so sure. To look at that, we have to move to the field of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the problem of what is reality, how it is composed, and what fundamentally is existence. When we look at metaphysics, we don't usually look at philosophers for the most part of the history of metaphysics, but we look also at theologians. So let's have a look at how theologians also have considered the problem of artificiality. For theologians in the traditions of the Mediterranean region, so for Christians, Jewish, and Muslim theologians, the idea of artificiality is fundamental and banal at the same time. In the view of these theologians, since the universe is the creation of the great artifacts, of the great maker, of God himself, then there is nothing in the world which is not artificial. Everything is artificial. This is also the notion that we find in the very word cosmos in Greek to define the universe. Cosmos is not something natural. Cosmos means ordered. So it has the idea of an artificial order imposed over chaos. You find it, for example, in Plato, in the Timaeus, when he talks about the demiurge and how he orders the chaos of reality. Interestingly, this also led to interesting positions among theologians. For example, in the 17th century, the polymath and philosopher and many other things, Sir Thomas Browne, said that since the world is entirely artificial, then the best way to study the world is not through science, but through art, because art is the science of the artifice. So from a theological standpoint, what is interesting, at least in the Mediterranean tradition, but not only everything is artificial, but there is no such thing as nature. Because when we say that something is natural, for example, a tree or an animal or a human, we say that something is composed in a certain way because that particular form, that particular way, is the fundamental, original, immutable, and essential form that thing has to have. That's the natural form. So in our understanding today, something natural is something that has emerged spontaneously, naturally in that way. From a theological perspective, of course, there is nothing that is necessarily shaped in a particular way, essentially, fundamentally, since the very beginning, because it was a decision, God's decision, the decision of his free will. And he constituted things in a way rather than in another. But if he had wished to have done it differently, he could have done it completely differently. This is, for example, a position that we find in occasionalism, a particular strand of theology, most eminently represented by Imam al-Ghazali, a Persian philosopher of the 12th century, who said that if God at any moment decides to recreate the world differently, God, like a running program, creates it at every second. If he decides to change anything at any moment, everything would immediately and suddenly change. So we see in theology, so in that part of metaphysics that's done by theologians, to say that something is artificial is a very banal statement. Everything is artificial. But metaphysics is not only the job of theologians, also the job of philosophers. And let's see how this problem can be approached through a philosophical perspective, which is both very recent, for example, we find it in phenomenology, and very ancient. For example, we find it in the school of the Cyrenaics, but also in the Advaita Vedanta school in medieval India and in many other places. According to this metaphysical position, philosophical, we need to realize that when we look around ourselves, or when any awareness looks around itself, what they see is not directly the world in an objective and raw state, but rather our mind has to deal with an avalanche of raw perceptions. We then take these raw perceptions that invest us and we order them, we structure them to create a series of objects, to divide the objects between one another, and then to arrange them into a world, into a landscape that has meaning, sense, that has time and space, for example. So, in other words, also from this philosophical position, the world that surrounds us and everything inside it is not a natural object which we encounter, which we can observe without mediation, but it is an artificial creation of our mind. And there are corollaries which are very interesting. Since each awareness orders things differently, then each of us lives to a certain extent in a different world from everybody else, separate and distinct from the others. Here we find very interesting corollaries coming in the philosophy of the Amerindian metaphysicians. Amerindian means from the region of the Amazon forest, is what it means at the moment, this term. In their cosmology, the notion that everybody lives in a different world also entails that there is a continuity of consciousness that then emerges into different worlds. What we share is awareness, what we don't share is the world. Now, of course, here also there are some interesting aspects that would bring us to other places where I will not go now, but probably we will consider later when talking about also the political question and the fictional question relating to AI. In order to synchronize all these different worlds, we find methods. We usually call them civilizations, metronomes for worlding. But anyway, even on the second account, when we look at artificial intelligence in its being artificial, it doesn't seem to be anything truly exceptional. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we are just talking about yet another form of intelligence among countless other different forms of intelligence, and about an artificial object in a world that is made up exclusively of artificial things. But the fact that it's not interesting doesn't mean that it doesn't pose interesting challenges to us. Not because it's a new thing, as many people present it, but precisely because artificial intelligence reproduces and replicates the same specific limits of that form of intelligence that in contemporary societies we have at the moment decided to hold, and for quite a long time, as the paradigm to which every individual intelligence should conform itself, as the metronome for our form of worlding. So AI, as a form of intelligence, creates the world according to a particular way of observing, selecting, and recomposing its own perceptions, as Germán was saying at the beginning, into data. Now, this form of intelligence, which is typical of artificial intelligence, is part of its genetic hereditary legacy from its forefathers, or if you want to say it psychologically, of its subconscious. It comes from its forefathers being the engineers that started creating these systems. The engineers that created this system were steeped in the mentality, in the form of intelligence and world-making that was typical of the societies of Westernized modernity. And this particular form of making world, this particular form of intelligence, which they then passed on to artificial intelligence, postulates that the world can be populated only by entities and by objects that can be fully grasped through the means of linguistic tools, descriptive language. So a form of language that fully captures into one sign the object of its signification. The best example of this is the 1-0 that we find in IT systems, for example, with the clarity of division. So said otherwise, only the things that can be neatly cataloged and to which is possible to attach a clear and precise identity in each respect, only those things are legitimate features of the world. What fails these requirements, however strongly might affect our perceptions or be part of the raw avalanche of perceptions, we need to cast it out of the world as if it was mere superstition. Now, since we're talking once again about artificial intelligence and truth, but also we were talking about nature and artificiality, there is a corollary also to this. If we make world in this way, and according to the form of intelligence that was taken in the legacy by artificial intelligence today, there is only one correct universal method to observe, filter, and recompose all perceptions. And thus there is only one layer at which reality can be correctly understood as true to its nature. Westernized modernity and the AI has managed to reinsert the idea that the world is not artificial, but it is endowed with a monodimensional nature. And that this nature coincides miraculously with a specific range of capture of our language. So in terms of what it means to talk about truth, it follows that there is such a thing as natural truth, according to this point of view. And however pluralistic this natural truth might be, is monodimensional and is flattened to the wavelength of existence that falls within the catch and the capture of language. So it is also an idea of how reality is structured in itself. This has some problems. Political problems, which I will not discuss personally, but also metaphysical problems. The first metaphysical problem has to do with metaphysics. And metaphysics essentially is the question not only about how reality is structured, but what it means fundamentally when we say that something exists. When we say that something exists, we are talking about a problem that is beyond language. When I describe an object, I can say everything about this pen, the qualities, its history, but I cannot say anything more about the fact that it exists. It's being there, my being here. Only silence somehow points to this. In theology, this is the way in which this problem is usually addressed, through means of silence or symbolism. So interrupting language, ineffability. Now, the fact that existence in its pure state, the fact that things are, is beyond the grasp of language, means that it doesn't fall within the range of what can feature in the contemporary, westernized, modern, artificial intelligent form of intelligence and form of reality. This is a problem, of course, in itself, but it's not a massive problem because we are always capable of restructuring and rearranging our intelligence differently than we have done until now. For example, and to move to the conclusion of my talk, we could start from the basic intuition that even though existence is beyond language, even though we cannot catalog it, we cannot find the correct word to catch it, things still are. This still is. At least my awareness still is somehow. So if we start from this intuition, we already begin to have a more multidimensional notion of reality, in which the world around ourselves is populated at the same time by linguistic things, which we can neatly catalog and arrange, and by ineffability at the same time. So if we arrange our own world-making intelligence on the basis of this intuition, which contradicts the foundations of artificial intelligence and of westernized modernity as it is hegemonic in the world at the moment, we begin to create a cosmos, a picture of the world, a form of world-making intelligence that is no longer monodimensional, one dimension only that which is reducible to language exists, but that is multidimensional. Things are at the same time existing on several different dimensions. And not only that, but language itself becomes a refraction, a manifestation in infinite shapes of the ineffable pure existence that innervates and sustains everything. considering this sense, the problem of truth that we are posing at the moment to AI, knowing very well what is the answer of the AI to the problem of truth, is the typical, is a very primitive in a derogatory sense, idea that nature truly exists. But if we face the problem of reality from this alternative perspective, and the problem of truth and how to make world, then we can imagine that the evolution of our intelligence doesn't go in the direction of making a monodimensional reality even more rigid, as AI is doing at the moment. But rather it goes in the direction of holding together multiple dimensions and multiple dimensions of reality within each and every object, and to have a problem of truth that is no longer a monodimensional problem. For example, at the moment we understand truth in terms of facts. Truth is facts. Facts are the things that are true. But truth becomes an androgynous, a stereoscopic notion. Truth has to be predicated simultaneously about the different dimensions of reality. The problem is that the different dimensions of reality are often contradictory. So to close, I would like to give an example of how we could face, for example, a problem that is difficult to resolve at the moment. Let's imagine an account that we find in the 8th surah of the Quran, the Battle of Badr. The Battle of Badr was a historical battle between Muhammad and his followers against their opponents. It was fought in the year 624. The Quran tells the story accurately as it is, as it really happened in history, so to say. But then it also says that at some point, legions of angels descended from the hills to help Muhammad. Now, how are we to consider the truthfulness of this account? According to a monodimensional intelligence, so one in which reality is only in one layer, there is only one account, the historiographical one, which is true to nature, and the description of the angels refers probably to the belief of the fighters or to aims of political propaganda. If we use instead a multi-layered notion of intelligence, the one that I was just trying to sketch out, which of course I didn't invent, but it is a very ancient tradition of how to structure intelligence itself, this Quranic account could be considered simultaneously as historically true in the parts that coincide with the historiographical and archaeological evidence, so with the map of descriptive language. Mythologically true in the parts that have a symbolic function, so a function in which language exceeds itself and breaks itself, opening onto ineffability. And beyond truth and falsity, in its being a discourse about the absolute divinity, the unknowable Godhead, or saying non-religiously, the pure existence in its invisible state, which manifests itself historically and mythologically. So we can no longer talk in this alternative notion about straight truth or falsehood, or not even about relative truth or falsehood, but rather we have to talk about androgynous and stereoscopic forms of truth, according to which every statement, situation, object contains within itself multiple metaphysical layers, irreducibly different dimensions of reality in which every single moment and object exists. And when we talk about those things, discourses on truth and falsity apply in ways which are at the same time contradictory and that fall together, in Latin coincidere. They coincide. There is a coincidence of opposite between them. A coincidence, for example, between language and ineffability. The level of language where truth applies and the level of ineffability where the notion of truth doesn't make any sense. This is, for example, an intensive rather than an extensive form of knowledge. At the moment, we are trying to expand the extensiveness of intelligence to cover the totality of existence. Intensive knowledge is of a different quality. It has to do with multidimensionality rather than with the infinite growth. So this alternative form of intelligence that I was sketching is extremely scarce in the contemporary westernized modern society. And it's very distant from the paradigm that seems to inform the development of machinic AI. Speaking philosophically, it would be an exceptional event, truly, in the way in which we represent the arrival of artificial intelligence, if this other form of intelligence and of cosmology was ever to return to the scene of our society, embodied by us, by humans, or by non-human animals, or by machines. But this is not the case. Until then, I have to say that I was saying it's an important topic that is not very interesting, because having a new, also artificial, also intelligent, also entity that merely replicates our too human and all too westernized modern metaphysical shortcomings in a new generation of machines is just another step towards crystallizing the worldview that is already common and hegemonic at the moment. So in that sense, certainly the arrival of artificial intelligence is an event that will have massive consequences in terms of our social life, and many activists are fighting against it, especially coming from the milieus, also fighting against the combination between philosophical and political dimensions. I think about activists that come from the milieus of queerness, or of no borders, or of ecology. But philosophically speaking, one thing that we should probably keep in mind, that we are fighting against an enemy that is not particularly new, or we are facing a problem or a challenge that has very little of the novelty that the marketing of artificial intelligence likes so much to trumpet around. To say it as Gigi would put it, the situation perhaps can be catastrophic, but I don't think it's that serious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico, for this intervention. As I said at the beginning, questions will be at the end. But really, thank you. I will really like to discuss about this at the end with all the audience. Now we can go with our second panelist. We have the pleasure to share this panel with Metahaven, which is indeed very difficult to introduce, because they are present always in the current discussion, above all the discussion of communication and technologies, and of course narrative and politics. So Daniel, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, your work, or you want to focus for your introduction on a field that you work currently.
Thank you so much, Gamon. Thanks so much, Krisis Publishing, for the invite. Yeah, Metahaven was founded by Vinka Kruk and myself now quite some years ago, and we are, let's say that our activities can be summarized as filmmaking, design work that we do, and writing, and especially, the interplay between these fields. So we work in the art world. We make, well, we started doing music videos, but now we make sort of longer and shorter films. And we're interested in, the sort of cross-section points between, let's say, these, technological subject matters that are being addressed today, but also with their sort of like the ethical dimensions of these points, but also in relationship to art, and in this talk, especially in relationship to fiction. So I have actually some sort of like slide with some works behind me. That's actually the only image you're going to see today. So I'm not going to share like work with any images today. And the other image is a book by Svetlana Boym, her first book, Death in Quotation Marks, from 1991, which I really like the cover of that book. And I'm going to quote from that in a little bit. So when I say we in our talk, I mean basically Metahaven. I don't mean humanity or some sort of like big entity. I mean basically just us. And if it's not clear, I will try to specify it as we speak. So I'm going to talk. Can you see my screen with lots of text? Yes. So it's going to be looking extremely non-spectacular. I hope I can give it some life with the reading. Some weeks ago, newspapers reported that representatives of several European Union states had been in a Zoom call with someone who was said to be the press secretary of the imprisoned Russian activist Alexei Navalny. The political representatives were aghast when they discovered that the person in the Zoom call wasn't the press secretary and they had been tricked. The representatives alleged that they had instead been talking to a deepfake of the press secretary, a computer-generated, artificially intelligent image of the person saying things that a real person never did. Only a bit later did it appear that reality was even more prosaic. They had talked to an impersonator who, during the call, had made the unlikely move of wielding a wooden toy gun. There was no deepfake. The EU state representatives had been pranked. And in assuming that we are being led into discomfort zones by highly technological appearances and trained artificial intelligences, we are aiming high and excused for our stupidity in the face of omnipotent calculus. Yet we are forgetting about fiction, theater, and their distant cousins, spam and scam. In the shadows of big explanations lurk the prosaics of the absurd. In the same week, the Financial Times reported on a financial fraud case in which cybercriminals had gotten hold of the email credentials of a trusted business associate of a London investment banker innocuously named John. The hackers impersonated that business associate and persuaded the investor to wire large sums of money to a scam account they owned. The key to the impersonation had been personal quirks involving an allegedly Central European greeting, servus, which I never heard about that greeting, but that was apparently what made these emails believable. In the last chapter of his book on the history of spam email, Finn Brunton makes an attempt to define his subject matter and produces the compelling phrase for spam to exploit existing aggregations of human attention. The history of spam reads like the opposite of the glamour of tech, AI, NFTs, and Teslas. Instead, spam appears forever stuck in turn of the millennium Windows XP, replete with subscription pills and inherited estates, involving, quote, the widow of an aide to Saddam Hussein, unquote, looking for a compassionate soul who can help them get themselves and their assets, $55 million, out of this difficult moment in geography and history, writes Brunton. And I quote, the phone and fax numbers work. The web addresses point to real websites. Within this structure of real locations, events, and people is woven an intricate set of recurring fictional themes. There are companies such as Anglo Gold Corporation, Apex Paying Bank, Liquefied Natural Gas, Pétrole Ivoire, Novokubichersk Oil, their names as evocative of remote and unknown sites of money and power, as some invented Damascene castle or Galician dungeon must have been in the first centuries of the Spanish prisoner con, which is the urtext of what is played out in these emails. What spam allows us to do is looking at a simplified version of the current intrigue, like a childhood version of a spear phishing attack. Only a thin wall of separation divides spam from scam. And the difference is more to do with means and ends than with technique or method. There's a Potemkin impressionism, packaging reality in a wrap of fiction. But as easily can wrapper and wrapped we switch around, fiction becoming packaged in the real. This also is a docufiction technique that we could discuss under the umbrella of narrative cinema, inquiring into the problematic texture of a set of givens in which some things are real, some things aren't, and how the very unlikelihood of the fictional wrapper, begging us the question, is this real, makes the real side of things somehow realer, if that makes sense at all. Moving between simulacra, the authors of these narratives must first of all engage in establishing a sense of personal reality around what is essentially an informational industrial scam product, or even a weapon. Who are these authors and what is their game? Writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where a subject slips away, the negative, where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body. Writing, wrote Roland Barthes in a famous essay, The Death of the Author. Does the death of the author not apply here, in the sense that the readers of spam and scam, in many cases, even if they wanted to, don't know who it is that wrote, who it is that spoke. Living at the receiving end of weaponized information, especially weaponized information with the power of government and or capital behind it, is not about a kind of postmodern enjoyment. It is not about living between quotes or brackets, in which, because nothing is really true, everything is therefore ironic. Eventually, life itself isn't bracketed, and the truth is transparent. As the artist, writer, and researcher Luisa Prado suggests, quote, there are words and worlds that are truthful and true, end quote. Prado describes how media in Brazil deploy crude forms of information warfare over ecological disasters. For example, as vats full of neon-tinted pesticides spill over a highway in a residential area in 2019, the local television channel produces a headline about the beautiful colors of the pesticides. Post-truth goes hand in hand with a wider ecology that it obfuscates and that is yet plain to see. The risk is that we mistake this military informational complex for rocket science, which it isn't. No doubt, there is a philosophical project inside AI. There is a philosophical project in what AI's non-human cognition leads to, and in the similarities and especially dissimilarities it shares with the cognitive model of an atomized, centralized mind gazing out at things in the world, naming them or acting on names that have been given it. That's the potential for a philosophical project inside AI. Our willingness to fall for the scam is partially to do with a reliance on words and packed with an overdependence on communication in majority languages, relying on vastly reduced and impossibly generalized protocols of social convention for our communication. In preparing for this talk, we were joking with Flavia Sodon that the expressions webinar, I hope this finds you well, and pleased to e-meet you should have been left in 2020, upon which Flavia replied that these, in fairness, were left in 2012 or so. Representation through socially convenient code or jargon, but also through metaphor, metonym, and allegory, necessary as these may be in achieving results, also speak to the specific type of time-consuming verbal bravado that makes figures like Boris Johnson so unbearable, and the word pictures and provocations, the so-called word pictures and the so-called provocations by which right-wing populists paint their rhetorical information warfare into something they think resembles literature. At least when the former Venezuelan president, the late Hugo Chavez, in his personal TV show Allo Presidente, called George W. Bush a bastard and a coward, he wasn't being metaphorical. He was simply being truthful. A child's first speech acts do not consist of words so much as sounds. We measure the result that these sounds produce by something other than their effectiveness at transacting. While we tend to live by a working agreement that things in the world correspond to their names, we rejoice in a small person voiding that agreement and allowing us to join in a nascent speech where each word is new. The process of play reveals that names, concepts, and their outward purposes are merely under the illusion of our control. For example, an adult exclaims, "I'm dying to hear that concert," and then, "Why don't you die?" the child responds. Daniel Harms, a Russian poet active in the 1920s and 30s, was one among a group of close peers who started working at the questionable character of linguistic representation long before artificial intelligence prompted similar pursuits. Works by Auberiou, the collective or movement of artists that Harms formed part of, we may say, served both poetic, research-oriented, and theatrical ends. In many of Harms' poems that are set like stage pieces, authors, artists, and writers die right in the first instance, and often to great comical effect. In a 1934 piece about Pushkin and Gogol, Harms begins the poem with Gogol entering the stage by falling from the stage set and lying still. In another poem play written in 1933, the following encounter occurs between a writer and a reader. Writer says, "I'm a writer." Reader says, "To me, you're an asshole." The writer remains upright for a few moments, shocked by this new idea. Then he dies. He's being carried away. And that's the poem. In The Saber, a poem from 1929 that alternates between essay and verse, Harms writes that, quote, "Life is divided into work time and free time. Free time creates schemas, that is, pipes. Work time fills these pipes," end quote. He continues sketching out a scenario in which in their free time, humans engage in singling out objects, giving them names, asserting ownership over them. And I quote, "Free time is an empty pipe. In our free time, we lie on the couch, smoke and drink lots, visit friends, talk a lot, making excuses for ourselves to each other. We make excuses for our actions, separate ourselves from everything else, and say that we have the right to an independent existence. Then we start imagining that we own everything that is outside of us, and all that exists outside of us we call an object," end quote. This text by Harms, like other works from the Oberio poets, can be seen as a critique on language, illustrated in an idiosyncratic way by a sort of death of the author happening over and over in hilarious short stories and often right at their beginning, turning around whatever remained of a narrative arch. Instead of romanticizing the poet and their privilege, Oberio inquired into the language that it shared with everyday communication, using to great effect poetry's inherent incapacity at getting things done, to question what words do, and whilst offsetting this impracticality against many lyrical notes. Another one of the Oberio poets was Alexander Vidynsky. Vidynsky's work took place at an intersection between monastic religious inquiry, negative theology, and poetic innovation, in which what begins as an apparent pure chaos and confusion, or rather poetry seemingly written by a bot, in the later poems calms down to material that sticks, but is still exceedingly hard to grasp, especially when looking for useful material. Vidynsky uses techniques of illogicisms and reversals in combination with spiritual motives. In a collection of writings titled The Grey Notebook, Vidynsky echoes Harms's inquiry into representation in a manner that shares a zeitgeist with a nascent special relativity and quantum physics. Quote, "In reality, objects are feeble mirror images of time. There are no objects. Go on, try and grab them. If you erase the numbers from a clock, if you forget the false names, maybe then time would want to show us its quiet torso, to appear to us in its full glory. Let the mouse run over the stone, count only its every step. Only forget the word every, only forget the word step. Then each step will seem a new movement. Then, since you rightfully will have lost your ability to perceive a series of movements as something whole, which you had wrongly called step, movement as you see it will begin to break apart. It will arrive almost at zero. The shimmering will begin. The mouse will start to shimmer. Look around you. The world is shimmering like a mouse." Now, why are we sharing this with you, dear YouTube viewers and dear other panelists and organizers? Certainly not to suggest that the entirety of our techno-social complex can be understood with a few thin volumes of absurdist poetry in hand. We are sharing this to hint at the project of AI when it is unmoored from categorization and representation. And we are sharing this to suggest that the worlds of poetry and fiction, considered by many to be inherently useless in the face of what Hito Steyerl has called too much world, have a story to tell and a re-entry into orbit to make if we are to confront obligations to materialism and realism in any kind of durable way. The counterintuitive point really is that fiction and poetry may have been some of the unlikely victims of post-truth regimes, however questionable the word post-truth is, but let's not go into that. If technology somehow enables a perpetuity of fictions and fan fictions on an equal footing with verified facts and real information, then an inquiry is due into how fiction can be redeemed from such an entanglement. As is apparent through the introductory story about fake deepfakes, theatrical appearances that are mistaken for rocket science crowd our field of vision and are making our discussion of technology both fetishistic, because what would we be talking about if it weren't for AI, algorithms, and deepfakes, and also quite imprecise. Technology is also the common name for a system of network communications platforms whose benefits exist interdependently with the diseases that they simultaneously cause and treat. People use social media because it gives them agency and outreach, and yet suffer from a mental health crisis because of them at the same time. Within this highly unstable mental, psychological, and physical state, people become irritable and desensitized towards the notion of fiction, and yet we insist fiction and poetry are forms of honesty we need to be able to approach not just art, but reality. Rodney Brooks's essay, Intelligence Without Representation, written in 1987, was an AI paper in which a hitherto dominant reliance on human language-like representation of the world in AI research was criticized. Brooks claimed that when thinking about intelligence in creatures, representation is the wrong unit of abstraction. Instead of feeding the artificially intelligent creature with a complete representation of the surrounding world, Brooks emphasized that instead, intelligence should be seen as acquired through acting and sensing, thus requiring a creature to have its own experiences unplanned and unprogrammed by its designers. Not sure if that played out actually, but this was his intention. Ultimately, an increased emphasis on sensing leads to questions on whether cognition, as a scientific core of AI, is a localized affair happening within a sovereign brain, or whether cognition has no final locus and is somehow more distributed than that. And an image of such a cognitive substance or environment is, for example, the sentient ocean in Stanislav Lem's novel and Andrei Tarkovsky's subsequent film version, Solaris, in which there's this, ocean that sort of seems to feel things. In a widely read essay called The Extended Mind, Andy Clark and David Chalmers asked, quote, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? Further down the line, this touches on issues of non-human sensing, such as the echolocation in bats and the way in which such modes of sensing have been traditionally depreciated or dismissed in cognitive science. But it is by interaction with the rest of the world through sonar clicks that bats know what the world is like for them. So Michael Wheeler, in Reconstructing the Cognitive World, announces that, quote, I wish to join with many other thinkers in using psychological terms such as intelligence and cognition in a deliberately broad and non-anthropocentric manner. On this inclusive view, and inclusive are his words here, the cognitive umbrella should be opened wide enough to cover not only human-skewed examples of reflective thought and concept-based categorical perception, such as wondering what the weather is like in Paris now, or mentally weighing up the pros and cons of moving to a new city, or identifying what's in the refrigerator by way of concepts such as orange juice and milk carton, but also cases in which an agent coordinates sensing and movement in real time so as to generate fluid, flexible responses to incoming stimuli. Such a project potentially, end quote, by the way, sorry. Such a project potentially would decenter from human bias, just like Copernicus unfocused the solar system from Earth, which bias has named it the center. But it has not resolved the ethical issues inside and around what humans taught AI nevertheless. And it might be that Flavia is going to shine more light on that in the next presentation. We wish to conclude with another note on the death of the author, Barrett's proclamation that placed the interpretative aspect of a text decisively with the readers. In her book, Death in Quotation Marks, from 1991, Svetlana Boym discusses the lives of authors and their deaths in search for intertextual wrappings and emotional roller coasters that came to full fruition in her later and even more stunning book, The Future of Nostalgia. In Death in Quotation Marks, Boym reads Vladimir Mayakovsky, not an illogicist poet like the Biryu, but a futurist. And Vladimir Mayakovsky left this world in 1930 with a short note. And the note goes as follows. Love boat has crashed against the daily grind. I don't owe life a thing. And there is no point in counting over mutual hurts, harms, and slights. About this note, this farewell note, another poet, Marina Tsvetaeva, had some questions. Tsvetaeva writes poem, quote, describes the love boat rather ironically as an alien vessel on the poet's carefully styled Soviet ship of modernity, end quote. There's a suspicion here that the love boat, the Lubovnia Lodka, may have been American. And Tsvetaeva asks Mayakovsky posthumously, that love boat, comrade, what language does it come from? And here I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this wonderful presentation. I'm still finishing some notes, but thank you very much. Now we have our last but not least panelist, is Flavia Sodon. She is an Amsterdam-based writer, media analyst, and cultural critic. She is senior researcher at Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam, and her research is focused on the politics of artificial intelligence and algorithm at the intersection of neocolonialism, race, and gender. She is the editor of the blog This Political Woman, where she has written about big data, networks, algorithms, and community surveillance. She has been published at Decent Magazine, The Guardian, and The Washington Post, among others. Please, Flavia, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Buona serata. Grazie per l'invito, Francesco, Andrea, anche Herman. I start at the ground zero of Western hubris. I start with the question of what is colonialism. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Now, of course, the definition is vague enough that it refers to countries, and we are immediately led to associate these with nation states in the contemporary sense. However, colonialism in its original incarnation was based on occupying territories that were not recognized as countries, but instead portrayed as disorganized areas that were up for grabs. It was Edward Said who said that before their explorations of the Orient, the Europeans had created an imagined geography of the Orient, predefined images of savage and monstrous places that lay beyond the horizon of the known world. During their initial Oriental explorations, the Europeans' mythologies were reinforced when the travelers returned to Europe with reports of monsters and savage lands. As an aside, the Orient was not reduced to the Far East, but it included the Middle East, Africa, and eventually the Americas. Don't forget that the Europeans thought that they were going to the Orient when they set foot in the Americas. The goal was to get their hands on Asian resources. Countries then were only the European nation states with their bureaucracies, their established social hierarchies, their legal frameworks. Any other bureaucracy or social hierarchy that wasn't the colonizers wasn't recognized as such. The colonizer then, with a self-perception as the social order to rein in the chaos of the vast lands and the disorganized people. Aníbal Quijano brought the coloniality of power as a theory, and Maria Lugones completed this work through the coloniality of gender, and how different forms of technology from the colonies to now have been used to perpetuate colonial hierarchies. Of course, I am taking the concept of the algorithm as a metonymy for different forms of technology, from the databases of the oppressed that aggregated human beings as units of cargo during enslavement to today's use of surveillance and militarization. A metonymy, a word or phrase that is used to stand in for another word. A metonymy that is chosen because it is a well-known characteristic of the word. To use a cliche one, the pen is mightier than the sword, or the crown to refer to the king or queen. So along these lines, I refer to the algorithm in terms of technology and different forms of problem-solving techniques. Then an algorithm, an unambiguous specification of how to solve a class of problems. An algorithm can perform calculations, data processing, and automated reasoning tasks, computer functions and tools. In my research, I am interested in exploring coloniality as a core component of technology development, and in turn, how coloniality further expands through the algorithm. Additionally, I question discourses about technology and uses of technology from the perspective of systems of domination and control. We need to get past marketing jargon to question the developments and use of technology to support the systems of oppression. And to expand on the topics of coloniality, I'd like to recall the work of Maria Lugones, the philosopher who developed the theories of coloniality of gender. Lugones' work continues to be relevant to our engagement with technologies and knowledge, namely because of how she articulated the relationships of power that are inextricably tied to gender, race, and coloniality, which she defines as the analysis of racialized capitalist gender oppression, while the process of potentially overcoming this phenomenon can be defined as a form of decolonial feminism. Central to these terms is the definition and recognition of indigenous social structures and their relation to land, and the articulation of how these epistemologies occupy an oppositional consciousness to colonial systems of social, sexual, ecological, spatial, and temporal hierarchy. Maria Lugones describes this difference as the oppressing/resisting relationship. According to Glenn Sean Coulter in his essay For the Land, the Dene Nation's Struggle for Self-Determination, indigenous resistances against capitalist imperialism can be understood as struggles surrounding the question of land and knowledge-based practices, encompassing the relation to one another and our surroundings in a respectful, non-dominated, and non-exploitative way. Coulter defines this system of relationality as grounded normativity, stating, the late Lakota philosopher Vine Deloria argues that one of the most significant differences that exist between indigenous and Western metaphysics revolves around the central importance of land to indigenous modes of being, thoughts, and ethics. Further to this, Coulter argues that indigenous philosophies of non-oppression are defined through spatial as well as temporal relationships. Lugones refers to these Western versus indigenous epistemologies as cosmologies, standing in opposition to Western conceptions of epistemic. In her essay Towards a Decolonial Feminism, she analyzes these structures in relation to colonial imposition of gender binaries on indigenous communities. I go back to Lugones to recall how colonial modernity is positioned as the dichotomous hierarchy between the human and the non-human, summarized by Lugones' use of the term colonial difference. Lugones states that within the context of colonization in the Americas and the Caribbean, this hierarchy was employed as a tactic of subordination of the colonized to Western man. Lugones argues that relative hierarchies were constructed by colonizers to create a binary division between men and women, describing this distinction as a mark of the human and a mark of civilization. Only the civilized are men or women, which excluded indigenous peoples and Africans as being non-human animals, while upholding the status of bourgeois European women as passive reproductive servants of white bourgeois male colonizers. According to Lugones, colonial relations of power constructed through such binaries comprise the colonial difference, a term with open-ended origins that Lugones attributes to Mignolo. Further, she posits that colonial notions of femininity as inversions of masculinity did not grant human status, but rather established a gender dimorphism of hypersexualizing and sexual passivity that rendered colonized men and women as non-human gender entities. Through the performance of colonial anthropocentrism and the disruption of indigenous cosmologies of grounded normativity, extreme acts of sexualized violence could be justified towards gendered and dehumanized colonial subjects. I want to touch on another topic that somewhat continues these preoccupations while moving forward into the mechanisms through which these colonial practices are reproduced. This is what I call the pedagogy of robots, which again should not be taken literally in the sense of actual physical robots, but the way that technologies in general are taught languages, ideas, taxonomies, frameworks, and practices that continue reproducing colonial models of knowing, or to bring it back to what I just mentioned from Lugones about the dichotomies that were imposed through the process of colonization. These ways of knowing, which I call a pedagogy, in the sense of a theory and practice of education, are at the heart of a continuous reproduction of coloniality, which I insist remains an ongoing process rather than something anchored in the past. This pedagogy operates in two directions. These ideas are encoded into our technology, as in machines are taught to perform the administrative tasks of life through the encoding of this belief system. Every time a taxonomy is reproduced through these algorithmic categorizations, this pedagogy gets the groundwork through which it operates. But also, this pedagogy operates on us. Every time we are forced to choose a field in a database, every time we have to respond to census or registration forms with an ethnicity, a gender, a place of birth, etc., we are also being educated into the quote-unquote correct form of existing within the capitalist nation state. In turn, the media we consume enforces these ideas through normativity discourses. The aim point of these pedagogies is the naturalization of these different systems of power. A moment ago, I mentioned colonial ways of knowing, and I want to briefly touch on colonial knowledge, these forms and bodies of knowledge that enabled European colonizers to achieve domination over their colonized subjects around the globe. To go back to Said, we need to interrogate the role of colonized subjects and the production of colonial knowledge. Said, like Walter Mignolo or Aníbal Quijano, hold that the role of the colonized was negligible, at most permitting some of them to serve as passive informants, providing raw information to the active European colonizers who produced the new knowledge by imposing importing modes of knowing upon the raw data of local colonial society. To these scholars, we owe the development of the insight, ultimately deriving from both Gramsci and Foucault, that European colonial conquest was dependent not just upon superior military, political, and economic power, but also upon the power of knowledge or cultural technologies of rule. These scholars have shown how a whole host of colonial forms of knowledge, ranging from more clearly administrative forms like the census to seemingly more pure forms of inquiry like history and ethnology, have not simply described an objective reality, but rather have called that reality into being in ways that serve the interests of the colonial state. They have also highlighted the self-perpetuating reciprocal relationship between colonial knowledge and conquest. If knowledge enables conquest, this in turn enables the production of further knowledge, leading to more effective consolidation of political power. And although this knowledge, these systems are largely produced in the colony, they are not of the colony. Rather, this comes through the conjunction of predefined imported European forms of knowing, the investigative modalities with the raw data provided by the indigenous social and cultural forms of the colonized society. In other words, colonial knowledge is produced by the active agents of the colonizing society, the Western European in this case, because of the attendant loss of agency of the part of the colonized. To quote Walter Mignolo on the configuration of the world left by colonization, once upon a time, scholars assume that the knowing subject in the disciplines is transparent, disincorporated from the known and untouched by the geopolitical configuration of the world, in which people are racially ranked and regions are racially configured. From a detached and neutral point of observation that Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez describes as the hubris of the 0 point, the knowing subject maps the world and its problems, classifies peoples and projects into what is good for them. Today, that assumption is no longer tenable, although there are still many believers. At stake is indeed the question of racism and epistemology. And once upon a time, scholars assumed that if you come from Latin America, you have to talk about Latin America, that in such a case, you have to be a token of your own culture. Such expectations will not arise if the author comes from Germany, France, England, or the US. As we know, the first world has knowledge. The third world has culture. Native Americans have wisdom. Anglo-Americans have science. So if the European has science, it follows that the systems of knowledge, the epistemics that govern our contemporary technologies, will be equally Eurocentric. And here I would like to recall Nirmal Puwar's Space Invaders about the way these systems operate as part of state policies. In the chapter, The Negro and Language, Fanon offers a compelling and critical observation of the fact that French, associated with the culture of the mother country, carries the symbolic power of being the language of the civilizing nature. Whilst he focuses on the specific role of French colonial and post-colonial contexts, language is one of a range of methods that have been utilized to induce rationality, civility, and civilization in foreign bodies. To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. The Antilles Negro who wants to be white will be the whiter as he gains greater mastery of the cultural tool that language is. This is something that Fanon wrote. Language is intimately connected to governmentality. The association of European languages with rational thinking, the values of civilization and intelligence, is part and parcel of the long roots of colonization that were post-colonial times today. The stamp of superiority and assimilation has been and continues to be borne by language in the workings of racial governmentality, and this I go back to Nirmal Puwar's Space Invaders for this. Today, different languages and accents from around the world slide past and into each other on the streets of Western cities. However, in the higher echelons of social life, in professional occupations, it is only the imperial language that is a requirement, but rather a specifically classed form of speaking. What Breton themed perfect French, or what Bourdieu has incisively coined as the legitimate language. Language is intrinsic to the somatic norm in the professions, and the imperial legitimate language is a key tacit requirement. The acquisition of the national language is absolutely key to the performance of public positions. Thus, language can be viewed as a central element of the corporeality of authority. The state language is obligatory on official occasions and in official places, schools, public administrations, etc. in the Netherlands, so much so that learning the language for a non-Western foreigner is mandatory under threat of deportation. This state language becomes the theoretical norm against which all linguistic practices are objectively measured. Bearing symbolic power, the national language is considered to be the only way of speaking, while other ways of speaking, like slang, regional, etc., are viewed as inferior vulgarities. So what would these ideas around language have to do with what I referred to earlier as the pedagogy of robots, you might ask? I would like to posit that what Fanon refers to as the imperial language is the language of technology. Siri or Alexa do not understand dialects. They do not respond to slang. They are not programmed to understand inflections or tones common to street language. The systems are trained to operate in very normative language settings. Even recognizing a foreigner's accent can be difficult when these artificial intelligences have been trained with speech patterns involving a very small group of native speakers. However, it is not just harmless technologies that are impacted by digital language normativity. In some cases, failing to quote-unquote please the speech recognition software can have deadly consequences. This was a couple of years ago in the news. Germany to use voice recognition to identify migrants' origins. Germany plans to use voice recognition software to verify that many asylum seekers' applications it receives. But the technology is far from perfect, experts warn. According to the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, around 60% of people who sought asylum in the country between 2016 and 2018 didn't have identification papers with them. Now, German authorities are planning to use new voice recognition software to verify the asylum seeker's country of origin, according to a report on Die Welt. The test, which will begin in 2 weeks, this is when it was written, and will be rolled out widely between 2018 and 19, aims at analyzing and identifying the dialects of people seeking asylum using recorded speech patterns. The software is based on the same voice authentication technology used by banks and insurance companies and would help officers review the application sources of origin. Germany has used speech analysis since 1998 to determine country of origin. Linguistic experts listen to recorded clips of conversations and can discern dialectic variations, such as different names for food. But the new technology has caused concerns among experts in Germany. Linguistic experts have said that they have argued that in order to use this technology reliably, an analyst must have a solid background in linguistic analysis and be able to take into account a wide range of factors. For example, the fact that people will adapt the way they speak to the speech patterns of their interlocutors, she said. I don't see how automated software can distinguish whether a person uses a certain word or pronounces it in a particular way, because that is part of their own repertoire, or because they were primed to do so by the interviewer or interpreter. Another expert, a computer scientist from the University of Copenhagen, told the Welt that the new system would need the creation of a very accurate and broad database, which they agreed would be a very difficult task. Creating a perfect data set is virtually impossible because language is constantly changing. And I want to stress this. The system that is being used to determine the validity of a migrant's claim to asylum was designed for use by banks and insurance companies. Some linguistic experts insist that the nuances of language couldn't possibly be covered accurately with the current software. Linguist experts give examples of a recent study where they asked native German speakers to identify if an audio clip came from another native German speaker or not. All of the samples were in fact native speakers, but they had all lived abroad for at least 5 years. And again, the test group did not believe the samples were from native speakers. And here I want to make an aside to point to issues relating to dominant syntax, language construction, and grammar in regards to software originally designed for use by banks and insurance companies. In the beginning, I spoke about pedagogies. Machines are trained following the epistemologies of coloniality, and we are in turn trained to comply with these epistemologies. In this context, knowing, creating knowledge, or acquiring knowledge are not neutral terms, neither for humans nor for machines. Foucault theorized that inquiry into knowledge and truth that remain entirely in the domain of discourse is incomplete, because knowledge and truth are produced by and function within objective social structures of power. This is what he referred to as regimes of truth, which he viewed as vital for upholding power. And I quote Foucault, "Every educational system is a political means of maintaining or of modifying the appropriation of discourse with the knowledge and the powers it carries with it. What is an educational system, after all, if not a ritualization of the world, if not a qualification of some fixing of roles for speakers, if not the constitution of a diffuse doctrinal group, if not a distribution and an appropriation of discourse with all its learning and its powers?" And to continue, I would like to borrow from the research of Daniele Lorenzini on Foucault and regimes of truth. The first time Foucault introduces the concept of regime of truth is in chapter 1 of Discipline and Punish, where, speaking of the formation within the new penal system of the 18th and 19th century of a corpus of knowledge, techniques, scientific discourses that became entangled with the practice of the power to punish, Foucault argues that a new regime of the truth emerged. Now, what makes this concept so interesting is the fact that through this expression, Foucault links the notion of truth to the explicitly political notion of regime, as he does also later on in 1976 on a lecture, and here I go to Lorenzini's research on the regimes of truth, where Foucault in a lecture speaks of our regime of truth and error, and incidentally makes it clear that regime means here a certain power of separation between truth and error. But the most interesting text before 1980 with regards to Foucault's use of the concept of regime of truth is, without a doubt, the 1976 interview, The Political Function of the Intellectual, where Foucault argues, in contrast to a certain philosophical truth, is produced by virtue of multiple constraints and induces regulated effects of power. So to go back to the beginning, we circle to Walter Mignolo. Geopolitics of knowledge goes hand in hand with geopolitics of knowing. Who and when, why and where is knowledge generated rather than produced like cars or cell phones? Asking these questions means to shift the attention from the enunciated to the enunciation. And by so doing, turning Descartes and by proxy, the entire Western dictum inside out. Rather than assuming that thinking comes before being, one assumes instead that it is a racially marked body in a geohistorical marked space that feels the urge or gets the call to speak, to articulate in whatever semiotic system the urge that makes of living organisms human beings. By setting the scenario in terms of geo and body politics, I am starting and departing from already familiar notions of situated knowledge. Sure, all knowledge are situated and every knowledge is constructed, but that is just the beginning. The question is who, when, why is constructing knowledges? Why is Eurocentered epistemology carefully hidden in the social sciences, in the humanities, in the natural sciences and professional schools, in think tanks of the financial sector and the G8 or the G20, its own geohistorical and biographical locations? When Mignolo asks, why is Eurocentered epistemology carefully hidden in the social sciences, in the humanities, in the natural sciences, or in the think tanks? I want to add, how is this carefully hidden Eurocentered epistemology reproduced, enforced, and violently upheld through the algorithms that have become intrinsic to our daily lives? How are these technologies not only the foundation of these Eurocentered epistemologies, but the self-perpetuating mechanism that makes them inescapable? It is in this context that AI becomes the colonial regime of truth, through its taxonomical order, racial classifications and hierarchies of data aggregation, its taxonomies of gender and demographics. It is not that AI can be seen as part of the way truth is disseminated, but AI itself, the algorithm itself, is truth itself. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Thank you very much, Flavia, for this wonderful presentation. I had in mind all the corpus you work, and I had this sentence by I'm currently working a lot on Heidegger, that language is the house where the being dwells, and I think this can be the field rouge of the discussion. Language, we deal so in this panel with all the declinations of language, but I think we have some questions from the audience. I will read the first question. It's for Federico. I think so. You recently described experiencing reality as a narrative operation. Can you go further on this concept and the role of language as a framework of our own subjectivity?
Okay, it's a massive question, so I don't know how much I can enter in depth, because as every speaker on the panel has looked at one particular aspect of this. What I was trying to say when I was looking at the narrative quality of the world is that the way in which we do make sense of things is to arrange them, separate them, treat them as individuals, create them as objects. Even ourselves, we create ourselves as narrative objects. So as separate entities. My neck is separate from my shirt. Not naturally, but because I treat them as separate, I make a distinction, and so I can move the shirt away from my neck. This way in which we separate things from one to the other is, first of all, an artificial creation in, let's say, in terms of matter itself, there is no natural division between things. There is always only a narrative division between things. It's operated by the way in which an awareness as an agency interacts with the world. This form of interaction is first and foremost a way of separating, which is a linguistic way of separating, treating things differently by imagining them as different units. This imagination operates, as I was saying, linguistically. And for this reason, when you combine all these different operations together, you have a syntax, you see the rules of a certain grammar, and eventually you also have a certain narration. So in that sense, we can see the way of making world a form of myth making, narration making. Now, here there's also a problem, which is that if we're looking for something that is outside of the narration, something that is pure, and as I was saying earlier, natural, so not an artificial narrative artifact, but something that is always and already there, we encounter some problems, because at the level of language, we don't find it, but the level of language is the level of the world. For this reason, earlier when I was talking at the beginning of the panel, I was referring also to theological and mystical traditions, simply for the reason that they have engaged very often in all the different parts of the world, in different ways, but not so different, with the problem of what lies behind the narration, but not in terms of trying to describe it scientifically or anthropologically in any other way, but engaging with it as an element of silence, as an element of ineffability, as a suspension of the dialectical narrative reason. Trying to keep together these two things has been a very difficult task for everybody, including for the mystics, many of which decided to abandon the world entirely to join what is beyond the narration. And also for the non-mystics, who derided the mystics as idiots, who were not in on the joke. I believe that would be an interesting challenge, an important challenge, to try to keep the two things together. And to finish, just to say, the main reason why it would be an important and interesting challenge is because at the level of the narration operates power. At the level of the narration, the distinctions that we make can become distinctions that make the world, and at the level of the world, we exert power. Now, there will be certainly a revolution the day after tomorrow, but until the day after tomorrow, until then, how can we deal with the experience of being constricted and oppressed within the norms of language, a language that we don't seem to be capable of transforming in the current conditions of power? Providing an escape, not as a form of madness, but as an alternative form of world building, an escape that includes the ineffable, that allows you to step out of language. It is, I think, an interesting and important pre-political or side political option. But I would like to know if the person asking is satisfied with the answer.
Okay, we will wait if he or she answer. I was still thinking on this sentence that if language is the house where the being dwells, and then while during all your presentation, I was thinking on a work that influenced all my let's say my works. It was a book. It's a book by Marcuse, One Dimensional Man. And during all your presentation, that I start to be convinced that this text could be or could have again a privileged position in the discussion. I don't know if you are familiar, or the panelists are familiar with One Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse. And above all, I thought on this text because there was something a notion that was not really clear for me until Metahaven today, Daniel, today present, show us how bad words are kind of expressions of freedom, and all this was a concept that Marcuse highlights in his book. So it's very interesting that the question of language comes and takes a relevant position in the discussion when we talk about possibility of developing a technology that alienates us the decision making, that alienate human communication from all this process of decision making and all this process of, let's say, encounter the world. So I would like to ask Daniel, it's really possible to imagine a fiction, let's say a narrative, outside all these mechanisms, because that's, as I always understood narrative and fiction as complex and fixed structures that we use to capture the attention, to establish a common or a shared event that we can still share with the other subject or with the community. So can we imagine, or in which way can we imagine vectors that can put us outside fictional or narrative structures, being still in this field of narrative? I don't know if I explain myself.
I don't know, Germana. I think that's very hard to very difficult to answer, right? Because text writing, fiction writing is bounded by practices, and these practices are part of the known, or they're part of a knowable world. So I simply don't know. I think that what the talk that we wrote, that tries to emphasize is a few things. You know, it's first of all to do with the notion of the scam, and the notion that when we're talking about technology and we're talking about AI, etc., but we're forgetting about the crude theatrical possibilities that, you know, fiction tactics offer to trick us into this sort of weird entanglement with, you know, our belief that we're being overpowered by technology, whereas we're being overpowered by our own inability to use a literacy that we have, but lose with the fact that we do not admit fiction and by extension of that poetry to the table. So rather than talking about narratives, you know, there's this one thing that, you know, Frederick Jameson said, which you know, a versatile author, of course, but also he's a I think distinguished professor of comparative literature at Duke University, and he talked at some point in his latest book, Allegory and Ideology, he talks about the Cold War, and he said, like, I don't really distinguish between fictional and real frames, as in so much both are narratives. And I feel that there's, in that analysis, there's some, you know, grasp on what's going on, you know, when we talk about ways in which fictions and even fan fictions, etc., are in a sort of weird entanglement at the moment with, you know, what we describe as reality. And I think, to conclude, the other point that the talk tried to make is that, in a weird way, fiction and poetry are the unlikely co-victims of this obsession that we currently have with the idea that things should be real and true, which is understandable, very much so in the context of our livelihoods, but which, on the other hand, is threatening our literacy in reading the ways in which fiction can operate on us in a kind of political sense. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question here. I think it seems for the three panelists, or to say, Metahaven has highlighted fiction as a tool to escape the monodimensional reduction of reality. Federico was addressing the need to understand and practice fiction and fictional narrative in new forms, away from the hegemonic colonialist directions described by Flavia. Can you comment on the relation between fiction, truth, and language, and the possibility to articulate new linguistic approach, able to escape or deconstruct the monodimensional and colonialist reality we are facing now? I think it's for Daniel also.
Maybe Flavia wants to go first.
I can. One way that, I mean, I'm not a solutionist person, first of all. I don't believe in anyone here or anywhere should be providing solutions. Solutions should be organic. How do we usually will come as a top-down? The answer to that will come from as a top-down thing that I really believe is counter to precisely the process of decolonizing. No, but one thing I'm very interested on a personal level is in dismantling syntax and dismantling the notion of the accent, no? Especially in a place like the Netherlands, where the accent is what marks you as the other, amongst other things. Of course, your appearance will mark you as the other, the way you dress, but the accent is one, especially in job interviews. It's demanded that you speak something that they call accentloos Netherlands, Dutch without an accent. And the dismantling of these notions, disrupting these, as well as disrupting not just the narrative, because the narrative is one aspect, but the way that grammar and syntax are enforced as tools, as hierarchical tools. And of course, we can say that I am now going to mess with the notion of sense, making sense, if I disrupt syntax or grammar, which is true. I would, mostly because I think that a lot of common sense or sensical operations are nothing of the kind. So yes, I'm interested, because I work in an art school, I'm interested from that perspective in how do we disrupt these structures, because they are at the core. They're at the core also of the construction of the algorithm. And again, I go back to what I said, that the algorithm for me is a metonymical artifact. No, what I'm talking about is different forms of problem-solving technologies. And in that, I want to disrupt the very grounds on which this rests. And it's the way we speak, both the accents we use, the grammar we use, the syntax. And lucky for me, I'm at a school where that is something everyone is very interested. So I have a common project, but that's on a personal level, one of my approaches.
Thank you, Flavia. And David, Federico, do you want to add something, Federico?
Yeah, I will be brief. As Flavia was saying, yes, of course, it's always interesting. I mean, contradictory to have a top-down approach. Unfortunately, is also the nature of the medium itself. But I would suggest that possibly there is a way to imagine the relationship between fiction, truth, and language, even though only in a couple of minutes. When we create a structure of the world and the things that populate it, for example, races. Let's imagine this notion, the notion of a race. The notion of a race is a fictional notion, obviously. It's a fictional notion that then, if included within a certain picture of the world, creates a certain world populated by races or populated by nations or any of these things, populated by genders, animals and humans, and so on and so forth. It creates a certain landscape, fictional landscape. Once that landscape is believed it and embodied and is taken literally and seriously, as if, with a certain investment, then that landscape gives the conditions to define what is true and what is not. What is true is what coincides with the landscape, fits into the landscape. What is not doesn't fit into the landscape. That's false. Now, to this, we can react sometimes with a dialectical hostility, so with a direct confrontation against it. The risk of this is that attacking truth directly by trying to disprove it and saying that it's not true often has the effect of reinforcing the very same paradigm, simply because if we remain at the same level without questioning the paradigm that created the truth itself in the very beginning, then we just end up reinforcing it. Another possible way of departing from this newly created truth is to depart fictionally. So to invent a different type of entities, which inserted in a different landscape create a new world, which if embodied, create the condition for a new truth, and so on and so forth. Fiction, to me, is at the same time what establishes the conditions of the paradigms of truth, but also the way out of certain paradigms into new ones.
Thank you, Federico. Daniel, do you want to add something?
Well, I mean, I must admit that I lost the question in the two answers. So could you repeat the question?
Yes.
Sorry about that.
The question was, Metahaven has highlighted fiction as a tool to escape the monodimensional reduction of reality. Federico was addressing at the need to understand and practice fiction and fictional narrative in new forms, away from hegemonic colonialist directions described by Flavia. Can you comment on the relation between fiction, truth, and language, and the possibility to articulate new linguistic approach, able to escape or deconstruct the monodimensional and colonialist reality we are facing now?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I do want to say one thing about the fact that we're not proposing fiction as a tool. I think we're like not doing a solutionist thing here in this talk. So I just wanted to, that it's not the solution to just, go and make fiction. But I wanted to maybe react to the notion that language, as Flavia talks about, that language that is used and in the context of a sort of nation state project is a very normative project where speaking the language is actually an exclusionary tool to actually not just guard what is said, but also how, etc. And that convergence on the same language as we do now with English, which is neither the mother tongue of any of the people here in the panel, narrows down, let's say, what we can say and how we can say it probably in a significant manner. That's not to say that it's not okay to speak English, but it's to say that there's also the notion of languages that go extinct, for example, languages that are not the conversion point anymore for enough people, and every language that is lost is a world that is lost. So the normativity of a voice like Siri or Alexa that Flavia talked about, I think is a very compelling example of how language works as an extinction tool, in the sense that the very normativity of the sort of language you're supposed to speak to Alexa or Siri also takes away every little inches, little bits from the potentiality to use other languages than that language. But I mean, to be honest, the symposium was like so dense. It was so full of material, so full of things that were said that are still sort of, circling, at least within me, that I would like to stick to this, but probably not having answered this question in a good way. But thank you so much for at least bearing with me.
Thank you. I have maybe not a question, but a reflection above all when I was hearing Flavia. And there was a big debate when I was a student, and I started to be interested on media studies, and there was this period under the influence of what we call today the utopia of digital. Now digital will change and will create we talk about a participative democracy in that period, but there was something that for me was very interesting, that we discussed about this new technology that start to influence and to break, let's say, the linearity of the text. So we talk and discuss during years about the disappearance of the book, and the book will disappear, but we will just facing maybe the disappearance of the text and the textual form. And this is related to reason, to logos. No? So this is according to you. So what do you think about the role played by this new technology, digital technology, in relation with this possibility, or maybe it's happening? So when I see this hypertextual structures that we deal with every day. And when I see after the introduction of HTML5 that we can have these images part of the text, and text and image are not really related. Do you think, Flavia, this familiarization with this technology is the engine to this questioning and this, let's say, analysis on the power of the language, on the power of this textual form in the way we create and we build our system today? I mean, it's the product of leaving this old system, let's say, that let's call it the alphabetic system that allow us to take distance and to analyze this in the terms you analyze today.
That's a very big question, and the answer is simultaneously yes and no for me, because on the one hand, I don't think we can go back to not having these things. It's not that we're at a point in humanity when we can say, oh, let's start all over again. I mean, how? I don't think that that is feasible. And that transcends talks about revolution or, you know, we are talking about the ground on which we are built as a species. And that is the languages we use and how we use them. And that includes the algorithmic languages, the HTML, but also the JavaScripts and the different. What I propose is slightly left of field for that, and it's that we call into question the taxonomical order that makes these languages, because the taxonomical order is what forces us to choose a field in the database to who we are, and the nation state is dependent on that choice, because that's how issues around nationality or around class or around migration, etc., are defined. Even something as simple as property registries carry the information of how much worth we are as a person, because the moment that your racial background, your immigration status, and who your neighbors are is added to the information of the property registry, you have an assigned value for the real estate developer. So all of these things are taxonomical orders, whereas we will not be able to do away with the language of the machine itself. We can do away. How? That's a big another question, no? But we can do away with the taxonomical order that has become the pedagogy of the machine. That is what the machine is taught to distill for the nation state. And when I say the nation state, I don't mean exclusively governments. I think of a more expansive notion of the nation state that includes corporations, that includes all the other institutions, the healthcare system, etc., etc. That taxonomical order is what needs to collapse in order to transcend these things with machines. I don't foresee that this is a simple task, and I don't say any of this lightly. It's more of a utopian, if you will, aspiration than anything else.
But my question here will be, is this collapse generated by the machine in a way of independently introducing a new order, let's say by imposing in our logos a different order, let's call it an hypertextual order and not an alphabetic order? And this could create, according to you, or what do you think, that can create the collapse or
no,
not?
And I tell you no, why not? I don't know if you can program. I can write HTML code, not advanced, but enough. The HTML depends on these categorizations. Without them, HTML would not function, as would not JavaScript or any database. So what would need to happen is a completely new order, or a lack of order, but that would render the current language useless, in the sense that it wouldn't be possible to utilize it. So I don't think that with what we have now, we can collapse those categories. A new form of organization would have to be thought. But that's also why, for me, a lot of the discussions about how do we fix social media, and I'm asking a question that is currently a lot in the media, how do we fix social media? We're not going to fix social media because social media is symptomatic of us as a culture. So for me, the question is much more, how do we fix the culture? And then the machines will follow, because we then will be able to produce machines that are not what they are now.
Yeah.
The robots are a mirror, basically. It's us.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think there are questions. Let me check, but I will have a question or maybe a remark, and I will have your point of view on that, because related with all this conversation and this discussion around truth, and for sure, since Federico's presentation, truth, it's so we have clear that truth is completely related within the object, with what is in front of us, and this is the perception the collective perception we have on that. I was thinking during all your presentations of a sentence that maybe passing a second ground from Lyotard's the postmodern condition, and it was a very small sentence, but in my opinion, really highlights what is happening now, and it's directly related what we are discussing with Flavia now. And he says that the physics, so the nature for the modern, postmodern humankind will be data. So we exchange this for data, according to Lyotard. And this will mark the way our being in the world. So our being in the world will be organized and imposed by this data. And if I follow I understood Flavia's comments, it's still, the organizations of this data is still a projection of the human order that we project through this machine. So the question will be for you, for all you, if technology was always an extension of human body, can we say that these technologies we are dealing with every day can we describe them through this old formula, extensions of human body? Or what is this? How can you describe these technologies that influence so deeply our being in the world, a world made of data? I don't know if, who want to answer. For example, Federico, if you have an idea on or if you want to contribute to this question of how can we describe these technologies? Can we follow the old pattern and say these are extensions of human body?
Well, sure. Well, technologies are not only extensions of human bodies, in the sense there are also ways in which we create human bodies themselves. Simondon, for example, talks about technologies also in the sense of individuation. I would imagine that maybe in a general sense, technologies are not so much extensions of our human body, also because the definition of what exactly is my human body, it's also a very murky terrain. It's difficult to decide. I fictionally, once again, decide that this coincides with my human body or that is not my human body. I would say that they're rather maybe extensions of our cosmologies. We create these notions of how reality is structured, how it is populated, and so on. And in accordance to this structure, then we create these technologies that we embed within them. But just moving slightly to the side of this, I would also comment that it is quite extraordinary at the moment how we focus so much on the technologies and the impact that they're having on our culture. While I completely agree with Flavia that we should probably focus more on our culture and the impact it has on our technologies. For example, when they invented the printing press in the 15th century, the books written about the invention of the printing press and its revolutionary and so on if anywhere, very few. And now most of our books are on, the transformations of technology itself. There is an obsession with the tool and a complete forgetfulness of the culture.
Thank you. I agree also with this remark. Thank you very much. There is no other questions from the audience, and
there is one for Flavia and Daniel.
Oh, really? I don't see it.
You are on top of it, Federico.
It's on YouTube.
Can I, while we look for these questions?
Okay, here.
Can I answer your question as well, Herman?
I'm seeing from the chat in YouTube. Sorry, I didn't see. So the question was, where do you see the future of communication speculating on the truth of the machine? And it was a question for Flavia, I think. Sorry, Daniel, please.
Well, no, I just wanted to briefly quote. When you were talking, I was pulling up this quote by Donna Haraway from 1988 to stay with my practice of having really old texts at the center. The eyes have been used to signify a perverse capacity honed to perfection in the history of science tied to militarism, capitalism, colonialism, and male supremacy to distance the knowing subject from everybody and everything in the interests of unfettered power. The instruments of visualization in multinationalist, postmodernist culture have compounded these meanings of disembodiment. The visualizing technologies are without apparent limit. The eye of any ordinary primate like us can be endlessly enhanced by sonography systems, magnetic resonance imaging, artificial intelligence-linked graphic manipulation systems, scaling electron microscopes, computed tomography scanners, color enhancement techniques, etc., etc. Cameras for every purpose, from filming the mucous membrane lining the gut cavity of a marine worm living in the vent cases on a fold between continental plates, to mapping a planetary hemisphere elsewhere in the solar system. And then Haraway writes, vision in this technological feast becomes unregulated gluttony. All seems to not just mythically about the god trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have to put the myth into ordinary practice. Sorry, I just read that. I didn't do anything here, but I think it talks about that extension as well, but also about the role of vision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. So there is a question, I think, that should, so for time, it should be the last one. So it's to Flavia. Where do you see the future of the communication speculating on the truth of the machine?
The thing is, I believe that the truth of the machine is our truth, in the sense that, like something that also Federico touched upon, we create these and we instill, these are artificial in the sense of both the artifice, but also in the traditional definition of the word, not something stemming from the natural world. So the machine itself carries our truth. And what the future is for that, and I would like to speculate positively and say how the future truth will be a lot more egalitarian, etc. But that's not what I really believe in. I believe that the future will be whatever we make of it. And given the current situation with the pandemic, which I'm going to be the person who brings it up at the end of the event, even though we have avoided it successfully throughout the whole thing. But I feel that the pandemic is such a good lens through which we can see where the world wants to go. And here, okay, I see a lot of resistance to policies of care, no? A lot of, in media and social media, anything that comes from caring is dismissed and it's treated as oppression and stepping on freedoms, etc. There are a lot of conversations that can be had about this conception of freedom as an absence of obstacles, no? So what a lot of people are saying is that they are irritated because suddenly they encounter obstacles to their free roaming. So that's on the one hand. But what the pandemic is showing us is that there is a significant vocal percentage of the world that wants something else, that is in absolute direct opposition to the survival of entire groups of people. So what is the future of anything? The future of anything is a collective decision of which of these two oppositional visions is going to become the one, I would say, win, because this is not a war. This is a struggle for power. This is a struggle for some people, even for survival. Because in these oppositional forces, there is one group that says that caring or taking measures for the survival of the other group is a direct affront to their freedom. So in the answer to these, which is not an answer for this session, for this conversation, it's an answer for the next 50 years. But in the answer to that will be also the answer to what kind of machines we want, what type of taxonomical order we want, what kind of fairness and justice do we thrive for. For me at the moment, that is central to a lot of other issues surrounding racial struggles, gender, class, labor, etc., etc. So for me, the pandemic holds the answer to a lot of these questions that we're positing here today in regards to machines, but that seriously, for me, transcend the machine themselves. And they talk about us as a species and as the survival thereof. And I don't say this as something fatalistic for the next 50 years, but we are at an inflection point where decisions made today will have an impact for the next couple of centuries. And that's the answer to the question.
I think the question was also addressed to Daniel. I don't know if Daniel wants to add something. Do you want to read it?
Well, I mean, I totally second what Flavia said about care. I think that is a very big thing, that the conception of freedom is turning against care and collaborative survival. So, and I also agree with the notion of the pandemic being some sort of lens through which we can, see these questions. But I think that also there's big limits to, let's say, the abilities to do futurology. I do think that, and this is something we've said sort of in the talk a little bit, that we talk about technology, but we could talk about other things as well. And this is something that came back, I think, also with Federico and Flavia, and that we should have the conversations with each other that matter to us, also on the level of our lives, and not merely on the level of our professional interests. And I think that the issue here is that there is a risk, and it's always a little bit there, that we fetishize the instability of truth and the notion of post-truth to some sort of pastime for quote unquote academics or artists or researchers who can afford to feast on these phenomena, whereas there's other people that are bearing the brunt, paying the price for for these practices sort of elsewhere. And I think that is a risk that I always feel when there is an invitation for something about post-truth, that we forget that the truth exists and that there are things that are true, and there is also words that are true. And that is maybe a naive statement, or it's a statement that eventually hinges on a form of belief or a form of accepting some axioms, because of course we can talk about fact, but we can also talk about axiomatically defined truths rather than sort of facts in the world. There's multiple conceptions of truth that we can use, but I think that's a concern that I have. And I think that in the work that we do, filmmaking, etc., we try to express those concerns and also values, but also try to give sometimes, sort of positive propositions in this regard, celebrating things that we do have, and celebrating the joy of poetry and fiction in ways that still speak to the problems that we have, but do not put the problems central.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this. So I think time is over, and thank you very much. Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Flavia and Daniel, for this great conversation. I really enjoyed, and I hope we can find other spaces, maybe next time, real spaces to discuss and to exchange these ideas. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.